Welcome to the Efficient Spend podcast, where we help marketers turn media spend into revenue. My guest today is Shamanth Rao. Shamanth, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm very excited to chat. I was hoping we could start with just giving the audience some brief context into what you do and your experience with optimizing marketing spend.
Yeah, I run RocketShip HQ. We're a boutique growth marketing agency that helps mobile apps grow in a post-identifier world, uh, which has everything to do with the theme of your podcast, which is that in a post-identifier world, its measurement is nowhere as clean or clear as it used to be 4 or 5 years ago, when you could say creative A drove this much revenue. You just can't do that. So a lot of our work is making sense of messy measurement or absent measurement. And of course, the other big part of our work is making sure that creatives are dialed in and advertisers are set up to scale in the absence of complete data.
I'm glad we started with operating in a post IDFA world. I know that you produce a ton of great content around this topic. It was a large mindset shift for me in 2020 when SKAN kind of came upon us. And you think to yourself, wow, these numbers that I used to be getting are not the same anymore. Can I trust what I'm getting right now? Can I trust what I was getting before? When you work with your clients and you onboard a new client to RocketShip, how has your goal setting kind of process changed in a post IDFA world?
A lot, I would say. Right. And I think we pretty much in every engagement, we start by setting expectations that if you want to know exactly how much revenue this creative drove, it's not happening. I couldn't deliver it, and nobody else could deliver it. And if anybody is saying that is possible, they're talking BS, or they're doing something black hat, and which we could talk about. What some of these things could be, but really, in terms of goal setting, it's I think making our customers comfortable with the fact that they are losing precise granular data. It's gone not just for them, but for everybody. But there are non-deterministic techniques that we can use and we do use that we have a lot of confidence in that will nonetheless ensure that they're growing and they're growing profitably. Uh, and they will grow profitably even if they can't pinpoint exactly what creative A is doing in the mix.
For sure. What are some of those non deterministic techniques?
The simplest one would just be to look at your blended data, right? And say blended data and compare your sources. And, to be honest, for some of the smaller engagements we work with, we don't need more. We don't use anything more sophisticated because it's unnecessary. So if it's like two sources and blended data, we are like, okay, we increased Google spend yesterday. What happened to our blended ROAS? Can we get at least a rough estimate of how Google spend is impacting our blended ROAS? Right. So that's the simplest one. Then, of course, we do run, with some folks, it's more like geo level tests. It could be, okay, can we pause channel A in a country and see what happens to your overall blended ROAS for a limited period of time? Obviously, that has its limitations, and then we also look at organic uplift, which would be like, okay, we increased our spend, we got more paid installs. What happens to our quote unquote organics when we increase the paid installs, right? For many, but not all products, that organics go up, and we can reasonably quantify how much it's going up by for every paid install you got it, right? So you can certainly do that. And of course, for the more sophisticated advertisers, when I say sophisticated, these are folks that are at significant scale, north of 100, 150, 200K, what we do a month, right, on 3-4+ channels. It's typically, then we use media mix models. again, there are third-party tools available for media mix models and incrementality analysis. Uh, we've tended to lean towards doing using our own models, not because we hate any of the third-party tools, but it's because we are comfortable making our own models. When I say our own models, we customize what's available open source. Uh, the one we use most often is Robin by Facebook. That's ROBYN. It's the simplest one. We also use spreadsheet-based models for relatively simple setups. We just use linear regression. But to your question, for the simpler engagements, it's just blended analysis. For the most sophisticated ones, it could be media mix models that allow us to see what is the true value of a source in your media mix.
Sure. It's a great answer. I think different degrees of analysis require different types of models. I interviewed Mayur Sadra a couple months ago as the founder of Incremental, and we were talking about, well, for creative testing, if you want to see creative A or creative B, headline A or headline B does better, you can rely on Facebook data. You're not going to rely on a media mix model for that type of analysis. But if you're trying to understand, hey, I'm spending $100 million a year on media across these 12 different channels. Which channel should I lean more into? Which channels were incremental? You start to get into some of the more sophisticated analysis. And I've also started to do a lot more of not only GeoLift, but thinking about kind of what is the holistic impact of this spend. What's the impact to brand search? What's the impact to organic installs? I think the challenge there is uh, for the unsophisticated marketer or for finance teams, things like that, explaining some of these nuances can be a little bit complex, especially when you're comparing like Android and iOS, where you know this better than most. iOS, you might, depending on how down funnel the event is, you might see wildly different CPAs. When you see that, when you're running two campaigns and maybe your Android CPI is a little bit lower, but still kind of similar. But then when you get to a CPA per some downstream event and it's so different, what do you do to communicate, hey, we should still be investing more into iOS, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question because I've talked a lot about this. In fact, on another podcast, I put out like an extract, which is basic from the podcast, which is called "How to Train Your CFO," which is basically touching on this point, right? And it's a very real problem because CFOs, CEOs, decision makers want to know what is their ROAS. If they spend $1, how much are they getting back? Or what is the CPA of your Facebook spend? And if Android looks better than iOS, they need mathematical proof that says, no, we should be investing on iOS, right? So my recommendation for how to train your CFO, and this is something we have employed in our own work as well, is again, for smaller, simpler engagements, give the CFO blended metrics only, not what Facebook is saying. And we actively tell everyone, Facebook, you cannot trust Facebook. End of story. Do not trust it. What you trust is what's in your bank account. And that is the only thing you need to rely on. Look at your blended dollars in, dollars out. That's one way of looking at it, right? And it works at small spends, and people find it reliable. At larger spends, it's obviously much harder. If you're running 5, 6 channels, you're spending a couple $100,000 a month, then what we do is we use the media mix model, and the output of the media mix model is typically the true value or the true CPA of your channel. That is what we report to everybody, and that is what we tell everyone to take as a source of truth. So when we work with the CFO, they might see that Facebook is saying, oh, your cost per purchase is 750, we just say that's not your cost per purchase. Our media mix model says it's 55. That's the number you need to take in your reporting. And obviously, we can't run a media mix model every single day. So what we do is we take the ratio 750 to 50, and we say, look, whatever number comes back tomorrow, your true CPA is 1/10 or 1/15 of what Facebook is reporting. Let's take a multiplier. Let's agree on what that multiplier is. And whatever Facebook tells you, whatever Google tells you, maybe 1/5, 1/10, whatever your multiplier is, that is your true value. That's the number we would recommend that you take for your budgeting purposes, right? And obviously, a lot of this is not just a theoretical exercise, right? Oftentimes, we give this analysis and say, look, if you don't believe this, let's make a budget change and let's see what happens, right? And in one instance, we knew that Google was over-reporting massively, as it would, because if you rely on Firebase reported metrics, Firebase is wildly optimistic, right? And obviously, for understandable reasons, because they're the referee, they're the opponent. Nobody is going to dispute the fact that they're going to claim a lot of credit. Uh, and we saw this for one particular engagement we were in, and the client was wildly optimistic about Google because they were like, oh my God, this CPA is like, 1/5 or 1/4 of what Facebook's reporting. It's so amazing. We ran the media mix model and we were like, this does not look good, right? And Google is just nowhere as incremental. CPA is way higher than Facebook. They were still skeptical. And I was like, let's just pause this for 2 weeks and just see what happens. We paused it, zero change in anything incremental, zero change in blended metrics. And that was vindication. Again, not everything is as clean cut as that, but certainly you're able to make big changes to say, look, here's the proof of the pudding.
Sure. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. And I've seen this more specifically in the past with like programmatic networks that were just driving an insane amount of impressions, an insane amount of clicks. And you're looking at the data and then you're like, well, the CPI looks great, but what's going on here? And then you can start to identify fraud and things like that. I think within the industry, it feels like there's kind of two things happening. On one side, you have uh, brands and networks that are clinging for all of the data that they can and starting to protect this and using this to bid and to optimize. And then on the other side, you have this ethos of, well, ID based targeting, ID based optimization is going away. We have to rely on more incrementality. We actually should be investing more into some of these harder to measure channels, billboards, things like that. What's your kind of stance on this dichotomy that's existing, and is that a good way of framing it? Do you think?
Yeah, right. Definitely, right. Because I think ATT has forced a lot of folks to look at non-ID based channels, if you will, right? Influencers. I don't work with a lot of folks who do billboards, but certainly a lot more who do influencers. And I've seen that shift. Uh, and definitely the fact that people have woken up to the fact that ID based traffic isn't as trustworthy as they all thought it was. They have been leaning towards starting. Again, I think it's also a function of what scale they're at. Again, the smaller folks we work with, they're still on Meta or TikTok, but certainly the bigger folks, they do diversify away from the ID based traffic.
Right. It's a great point as well because I do think there's a difference between starting from zero and being at lower spend levels where most likely you can exist and serve and thrive on just a few channels like Google and Facebook. Um, you know, I work for a larger brand that runs a more complex media mix. We've been around for a while, and so considerations of incrementality and also a more full funnel approach is something we've struggled with, especially when you become a little bit more CAC constrained and you think to yourself, well, we really need to focus all of our efforts on performance, and we're not doing as much brand because it doesn't look good. But my philosophy on this is what happens is you end up over serving in that performance market and you've hit diminishing returns, but the attributed CPA still looks better than what it would look like in some upper funnel media. So I guess, maybe a good question there is, if you're talking about scaling and advertising, you're saying we want to go from zero to 100K to 500K to a couple mil. What would your philosophy be there on kind of some thought processes or systems to do that?
Yeah, right. Again, while we are very performance focused, right, I have seen that halo effect of having media in the media mix that's not 100% performance based. I have seen that happen. It could just be as simple as somebody getting featured on Apple, or somebody we work with was on national television, and their performance up on all of their paid channels improved dramatically in the week that followed, right? And that kind of halo effect is not uncommon. Uh, I, I think my own philosophy is that I think until a brand is at, let's just say, 100K or so, they shouldn't be worrying about any of this. They're going from 100 to 500. I think it makes sense to look at digital non-trackable media, which I think is, from the vast majority, would just be influencers and CTV, right? And those would be good places to be. And I think once you're past 500 or a million a month, you want to start looking at other media as well, other media partnerships potentially as well. And that's sort of the rough split I recommend thinking about.
Let's talk about for some of those larger advertisers then, right? If you are operating at that scale, do you have any advice for thinking about how to allocate spend across the funnel, right? How to know when you're tapped out on retargeting, or how to know when you should be going more into upper funnel?
Yeah, right. And, you know, it's very brand dependent, I would say, but I think the most straightforward way I have seen to be effective is just to see when any channel or strategy is starting to hit diminishing returns. Uh, right. And of course, if you have channels like Facebook and Google, you can start to see this very clearly. On non-identifier based channels, it's a little bit harder, uh, and it's less of a clear science. Like, if you're like on influencers, you're like, did I just get some influencers that were just a bad fit, or am I just tapping out? It's hard to sort of get a clear inference. Obviously, if you see a sustained dip, probably means, and I've worked with folks who are like, okay, we're going to have one burst of influencer campaigns happening every week. So we know every Friday our numbers come back. We know how we are doing, and in cases like that, you can see a more sustained trend. But unless you have something as consistent and sustained like that, it's less of a clear-cut science in terms of when are we tapping out, when should we cut our losses and move on, if you will.
For sure. I struggle with that as well sometimes, because I think that there are things to lean into that might not be as clear cut, that you still need to lean into. And sometimes you don't go into those because you're like, well, I don't have a clear testing strategy here. I have a conviction this thing will work, but there's no way to measure it. So we can't really do it, which I think is a mistake.
Yeah, right. And I know a couple of very big digital brands that were able to pull off this kind of growth because they had strong C levels that advocated for this. And they said, look, if we stay on Facebook, yeah, we're spending, tens of millions on Facebook. We are one of the top advertisers on Facebook, but this is not going to get us to the next level. We have to be on TV. We have to be in in-flight magazines. We have to get out of the digital sort of, viewership space because that is a local minima. And they had a C-level team that very strongly advocated for this. I would say in the absence of that kind of executive support, it can be very, very hard to break out of that local minima. Uh, and obviously they had the conviction also because this was a relatively mass market product. If they were clear that there was the target addressable market out there, so they knew they could do that. Right. On a sort of different example, I also worked with a word game that was very mass market, had been around for years, and this had very strong year one, year two retention metrics. And based on that, the C level for this game was like, had the conviction to say, okay, we will go beyond digital because we know the metrics are proven. Uh, and I think those could be valid approaches, but I would say it's extremely hard without somebody that's relatively senior having a lot of conviction that this is the way to go. We'll take up the losses even if this is not fully measurable.
To me, it's also a function of uh, creative testing and messaging, because there is only a, just like you hit diminishing returns within a given channel, there are diminishing returns within intent audiences in my mind. And there's only going to be a certain amount of people that are going to be ready to download that game today versus maybe they want to learn a little bit more. And so you build that upper funnel messaging. I know that creative testing is a big part of what you focus on. Do you also does RocketShip also lean into different types of testing, landing page, things like that? I think working with agencies, one thing I've noticed is there's always this challenge of you can only control what you can control, and you might come into a brand and they will say, hey, we need you to get us really efficient installs, but then you might look at it and be like, well, your product is shit. So when do you play that game, and how do you look at that?
Yeah, right. And I think we try to be very cautious about these situations before we get into an engagement. We look at product metrics very, very closely. We look at what their past performance has been. And if there isn't a lot of conviction that anything we spend is going to come back, we actually don't take that on. Knock on wood, we're in the fortunate position that we are able to do that. Uh, but you're right. It's true and valid that there's only a limited number of levers that we can pull. Like, we can test creative, we can test App Store screenshots, which are the landing pages for apps. In some engagements, we can test those, some we cannot test those. And in some, certainly what's happening in the product onboarding, we cannot test at all. What we try to do is every time we see numbers off, we try to give recommendations and say, look, your top funnel metrics are good. Your App Store page is terrible. You need to fix this. Or, again, I think this has happened a couple of times with very well-funded startups that have the intent and willingness to spend. And we've almost had this duty to rein them back and say, wait, if you're going to spend, it's all going to go down the drain. Let's fix your landing page. Here's what we recommend. Let's fix your onboarding. Here's what we recommend. We'll keep spending a small amount just to make sure you keep getting traffic, just so you're not going completely dry. But once you fix this, we can go full steam ahead. It's not always easy. And to be honest, it's not everybody's willing to do that, especially if they have investor pressure to grow.
Sure.
But we try to do what we can.
Yeah, I almost think about it like you should start experimenting or working on things that you can take from like 0 to 80 or 0 to 85. If the onboarding flow is just completely, broken, getting into a good place and then it's really hard once you get it optimized to get those, like, 3%, 5% wins. That's a little bit tougher. Um, but if it's at zero, if it's just horrible, you should probably at least start there. Um, that's something in my own career too. I have a lot of experience with optimizing paid media, and now I'm starting to think more about product things, like pricing, onboarding flows, because those are really important levers.
Yeah.
Let me ask regarding SKAN. I know that we are transitioning to SKAN 4. A lot of ad networks are in the process of doing that right now. Some have had hiccups, and we itself actually just transitioned our conversion model to SKAN 4. One of your agency's focus is around optimizing SKAN schemas, which, we talk to our MMP about this, and try to understand uh, what we should be optimizing. What is your approach there for advertisers, and is this one of those things that is low hanging fruit that you can really just, improve performance dramatically by getting it right?
For the vast majority, yes, it's a relatively low hanging fruit. And that's just simply because if all you do is maximize the number of conversions in the first 24 hours, you're going to be set. It's not something you need to change or optimize on an ongoing basis.
Right. And how do you approach that with advertisers? Is it simply just looking at their funnel and then identifying, different conversion areas that are?
Yeah, for the vast majority, it's looking at their funnel to identify something that has some correspondence or correlation with revenue or purchase. Uh, but in some cases, you might realize there is no event that uh, is revenue linked that happens early on in the funnel. In those cases, my recommendation typically is add an event that could be corresponding to a revenue event. For a couple of games, it could be a starter pack. It's like, hey, so rather than have a relatively high value purchase 3 days in, offer a low value purchase immediately after a user downloads. In fact, a lot of games have started doing that after ATT, and this is the primary reason.
Interesting. So they will shift their revenue strategy to give SKAN an earlier event.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. This is, and it's something too, I think we see in fintech, the fact that your primary event might take place outside of that 24-hour period, but some percentage of it does. So what are your thoughts on that, right? Where you might have a KPI, but maybe only 20% of those conversions are seen within the first 24 hours or something like that. Do you still include that, or how do you?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I try to just pick an event that happens as much as possible in the first 24 hours. I think if 20% of events happen in the first 24 hours, I wouldn't have a great deal of conviction that it could correspond to revenues. So that's a tricky situation, right? So, if you said fintech, so maybe you're looking at first sign up, right, or first time depositor. And obviously, because if you have a relatively long onboarding funnel, the first time depositor happens even multiple days down the line. I know fintechs for whom it's 7 to 14 days in. In that case, you just want to pick an upstream event that you feel is a reasonably good proxy. Could just be registration, complete onboarding, if you will, and just take that for the sake of simplicity for now, I would say. Yeah, there is no way around, and, sort of other corresponding example I can think of is with a lot of subscription apps, if they have a free trial, the trial happens 7 days in, which you're never going to catch. So you just optimize for trials, which even though a lot of trials end up canceling, is a reasonably good predictor of the eventual subscription.
Sure. And there's a big difference between optimizing an event and reporting and measuring it and paying attention to it too. Um, I feel like it's worth experimenting with bidding towards everything and kind of seeing what works, right? There's probably advertisers that could just bid to an install and that's it, versus a downstream event. And that's something we're definitely testing. One of the things with this with Scan 4 though, we're getting these two additional post backs, but it's kind of like, well, what the hell do we do with that? Because they're occurring so much later on in the life cycle. It feels like they're not going to impact optimization and bidding as much as they are just going to be measurement based, right?
Yeah, 100%, right? So I don't see any way the platforms are going to use that for optimization. I would say, they might, the, if let's just say Meta says, so if you were to take an example of a fintech app, your second postback could be, hey, actually signed up and made a high value deposit after 7 days. That's your postback two. The algorithm could ingest that and say, this is a high value user versus a low value user. So I'm sure there's some value the algorithm could get out of it. But because it's so far out in the future and it's also disaggregated, it's also aggregated, sorry. It's also aggregated, and your postback two and three are just low, medium, high, right? And for all of those reasons, I think it's just going to be very, very limited. For pretty much everybody, I just recommend just think about get the postback one right. That's the low hanging fruit. Postbacks two and three, nice if you can get it, but otherwise, don't worry too much about it.
Yeah, and I think it also, I mean, it's very channel dependent and almost campaign dependent in a way, because some advertisers might be, creating and pausing new campaigns on a weekly basis, and then so by the time that thing is paused, you're really not ingesting the data to continue to optimize it, as well. Do you? I mean, everyone's kind of excited about Scan 4. Are you? Where do you think this is going? Are you? I guess you're saying like you're not as concerned about the subsequent postbacks. What are the kind of things you're excited about with Scan 4, and I guess where Apple's attribution is going?
Not a huge amount, to be honest. I'm not excited about a huge amount just because postback one remains largely unchanged. Uh, and yes, they've added a course postback to postback one, so you can add low, medium, high in addition to the earlier postback. The net effect is that for if you're a large advertiser, you'll get a lot more signal. If you're a small advertiser, you get a lot less signal. The underlying workings of Scan 4 remain mostly unchanged. So that's one reason I'm not super excited about. The other reason I'm not super excited about it is it's been super buggy. It's taken down a lot of accounts in the last couple of weeks. And, all of this, even though it's nothing groundbreaking. So, to your question, that's why I don't find it to be particularly earth shattering.
Yeah, it's maybe creating some more headaches than anything else.
Yeah, it makes Apple happy. Some product manager at Apple probably got promoted because they released a new version. Good for them.
Okay. So has your recommendation to some of your clients to actually go into like back to Scan 3?
Yes, we have already gone back to Scan 3. Uh, well, yes, there are a couple of folks who switched to Scan 4. Things went south. They went back to Scan 3. Other folks, we told them not even try switching after we had a couple of bad experiences. Now that Meta has said they're rolling things back to Scan 3, we're still waiting and watching to see what happens next. But short answer, we are going slow in regard to Scan 4.
Understood. Yeah, it's ironic that this was released such a long time ago. I think at the end of last year, and now we're just seeing networks kind of adopt it. I always want to be, with the times and make sure that like our advertising stack is updated, but then you're also kind of like cautiously waiting and monitoring. Yeah. And another question I want to ask about optimization, and it's a little bit of a selfish one. Certain channels are allowing you to optimize based on value for iOS, right? Meta is one of them, and a lot of them are still, only CPA focused, and some still, Twitter, for example, you can only optimize towards a cost per install in SKAN. Um, what are your thoughts on kind of value based bidding versus more CPA based bidding, and when that's appropriate? It's definitely a industry or vertical specific kind of situation, I think. But we've started to test value based bidding, and I'm not sure it makes as much sense for our business, but curious what your thoughts are at a high level.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of success with value-based bidding, but it's very advertiser dependent, vertical dependent. Where value works well is obviously there's needs to be enough signal in terms of conversion value density. That's number one. Number two, the product needs to be whale driven, if you will. There needs to be a big delta between a low value user and a high value user so that the algorithm can take in a schema and say, this is a low value and this is a high value user, right? And a lot of this should happen within the first 24 hours. If that happens, there's absolutely ways to make value bidding work. We've seen it work for a number of apps that we work with. I would say the vast majority of these apps are games. Pretty much everyone that does this is games, because for every other vertical, it's not nearly as whale driven. This tends to be more CPA focused.
Right. I know we have a couple of minutes left. Would love to ask a couple of kind of like rapid fire questions. I guess the first is, within the context of the post IDFA world, are there any emerging channels that you're particularly excited about and looking into more?
Not so much, I would say. I think one of the effects of ATT has been a lot more consolidation, right? And I mean, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was running on 15 channels to manage like $1 million budget, and that's not happening now. And I'm talking about 15 digital mobile channels. So not as many emerging channels, unless you consider TikTok an emerging channel, and that's certainly something we're seeing a lot of success with. TikTok's been a big sort of win lately across our portfolio, but other than that, I can't think of anything else.
Cool. Yeah, I think TikTok's a big one, and it's an interesting point too. You don't need to be running on all 6 or 7 paid social channels. You can only be running on a few and still be efficient. Um, Last round of questions. This is the Efficient Spend podcast. So, what's the most efficient money that you spent on advertising, and then also the most inefficient?
Inefficient, I don't know if I can sort of give specifics. I mean, I don't, yeah. Give me a moment, right? So efficient would be going on Facebook Canvas back in 2013 when it was still cool to do so. And I still can't believe I was spending multiple millions monthly on Facebook Canvas. It was that big an opportunity at the time. I would say I think we were early enough on the platform to really nail it for a game. Most inefficient, I would say, there's actually quite a few. I would say, I talked about we were on 15-ish channels. A number of these channels are kind of spammy, kind of scammy, and they all promise the moon. And for a number of those, and again, to protect the innocent or guilty, I'm not going to name names, but a couple of them were like, they had terrible downstream retention, they had amazing CPIs, terrible downstream retention. Within 2 days, it was very clear that it was spam.
Sure. Okay. Cool. Well, this was great, Shimon. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Paul.